Welcome to Stories with Traction, unedited and unfiltered. These are real conversations with leaders who have walked through trials and triumph. In a world of AI-polished sound bites and scripted perfection, this podcast isn't about being flawless. It's about being purposeful. I'm your host, Matt Zahn. We're going to find out what drives these leaders, what's their story, and how can we learn from their experiences. Get inspired and enjoy Stories with Traction. Today, we're going to talk about an incredibly important topic because today I'm joined by Dave Snell. Dave is the founder and principal consultant at the Snell Advisory Group, which helps companies protect their information through cybersecurity. Welcome to the show, Dave.
Thank you, Matt. It's a pleasure to be here. Looking forward to a wonderful discussion.
And I appreciate your time, especially as we unpack this massive beast of a topic, cybersecurity, because I know you'd mentioned that has a lot of layers to me prior to us hopping on here today. So I want you to break down some of those layers. When you hear the word cybersecurity, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
First thing that comes to my mind with cybersecurity is everybody thinks of the IT side, the trons going from one place to the other, and how networks connect us, and the computers that we use, the phones that we use, tablets, whatever it is that we're trying to use to convey information is really what it comes down to. That's cybersecurity. It used to be a term called InfoSec, information security, but through the 90s and 2000s, it's morphed into this, as I said before the show, nebulous term of cybersecurity. And there's a history behind that, but ultimately it comes down to protecting information that we want to keep out of bad people's hands or keep private, however it is we want to protect it. That's cybersecurity, protecting information.
Sure. No, I appreciate you sharing that. So what do you do like on a day-to-day basis? Take us through like a normal day or week for you with what you do through the Snell Advisory Group.
Well, I've got a couple of things. Ultimately, it's about helping companies protect their information, like I said, and we go through a process of identifying with a company what it is that is critical to their company they have to protect to be marketable and maintain market viability. Okay, well then what policies, systems, processes do they have in place to protect that? And then I do a little matrix of, okay, where are the shortfalls? Where are the strengths? We do an after action review of that, and then we come up with a plan for protecting that information in the long term. And it's a week-long process generally, depending on the size of the company and how spread out they are and how developed their policies are. But call it a week. That's how it can play out of review, go through the processes, and then develop what those requirements are to strengthen their fortress, if you will.
When you started doing this, were you shocked with how vulnerable some companies are?
Yes, because it's a secondary thought. It's not a money maker. It's a money taker is how some people think of it in the executive side. It's not going to produce you anything to build and earn income. It takes away from your net profits. So a lot of people put it as a secondary thought. Therefore, it does lag behind what the threats are pacing them at a much greater speed than they can keep up with.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that. And it is interesting because it's all over the news when big companies get hit with these attacks. And I can't even imagine some of the lost revenue that can be experienced through this. So have you seen any horror stories yourself where a company that you might have been aware of wasn't protected and they got hit and some of the repercussions of that?
Yes, actually, a hospital that I worked at before I broke out into my own company, I was a project manager. I worked in the IT department, helping them, integrate new systems and softwares. And another Navy officer retiree like myself, we sat down and looked at their network, and it's all these clinics, these single, these offices of doctors' offices on their own that have access to the hospital's networks for prescriptions and for clinics that they send their patients to, specialties. And we looked at it and said, look, they're going to get hit. And these are the 5 to 10 different types of places where we think it's going to come from. Well, about 6 months after I left that project, it was done. I get a call from my old shipmate. He looks at me and I said, Rob, what's going on? He goes, hey, they got hit. And sure enough, it was one of the 5, 10 places we said they're going to get it.
Wow.
And it wasn't even a ransomware. It was just a slurping of information, patient information and billing information to say, look, all that information is now available on the dark web, but it could have been prevented had they done a thorough analysis and taken what we had said were potential threats. But they, again, bottom line, said, we don't think the risk is really there.
Wow. Is it, I guess they don't want to shell out the money to protect, and then they end up losing more money than they probably would have invested in the first place?
I will give you a quote I had from a financial institution in Chicago I worked for a little while. Vice president, senior vice president looked at me and said, it's easier to pay the fines than to pay the infrastructure.
Wow.
We'll pay the fines. That's fine. We don't care about that. That just baffled my mind that they were so laissez-faire about what they were willing to spend for protecting their own information.
Wow. That is wild.
And I'm
Wild.
not talking a small bank. I'm talking a major international financial institution.
Wow. That is incredible. Well, that is scary to think that there's a lot of companies out there that don't have a focus on protecting their client, especially patient as well info. But I want you to kind of take us through a little bit more of your story on what positioned you to get to this point in your life. So let's go back to teenage Dave. So when you were much younger, did you think that you were going to be focused on security? What was the thoughts? What did you want to be? What were you positioned to do? What was going through your head as a teenager?
Well, teenage Dave initially wanted to be a naval aviator. Top Gun had just come out. I think right as I was 14, roughly. And I said, I want to go be a naval officer. And my dad was a naval officer. My dad was a cryptologist in the Navy after having been a surface warfare officer driving ships for a couple of years. And I said, okay, I want to join the Navy. That's my thing. I'm going to go do it. And my grandfather took me aside. He said, look, the aviation thing's a great idea, but you might want to follow your dad's footsteps into cryptology. It's more cerebral. It's more a thinking man's game. It's a puzzle. It's code breaking and signals intelligence is what cryptology really is. But more importantly, it's a longer game. Being a naval aviator gets you, 5, 10, 20 years of flying. Maybe you go fly for the airlines. Okay, great. And I have a great old roommate of mine from my college years who's doing just that. He flew for the Navy and now he's an airline pilot, just like his father. But as I joined the Navy after college, I went as a surface warfare myself. Drove ships for 5 of my 20 years. And then I transferred to cryptology. And that's when I knew that security was really the name of the game and protecting information. And it is you look at any of my bookshelves here in my office and in my apartment, it's covered with cryptology, espionage, deception. And it really comes down to how am I getting information? How am I protecting information? Whether it's through espionage, whether it's through cybersecurity, hacking, code breaking efforts. Really, it really fits where I was thinking about after that chat with my grandfather back as
Okay.
a teenager. I mean, there was always the dream of being a pilot, but I think even college me would tell you that I knew that game was over as soon as I got to college. My grades just weren't that good.
Understood. So you mentioned puzzle and code breaking. So
Yes.
while you were a teen, was there anything else that you were doing, maybe like chess club, or because you mentioned like unpacking different things, and with puzzles and code breaking, there's strategy and there's game planning. Was there anything else that you were doing? Maybe it was a sport or an extracurricular activity that was positioning you to be more inclined to want to solve problems?
Um, I will say that I follow in my father's footsteps, step for step for step for step along our histories. And I grew up watching him and my mother do crossword puzzles. I attempted crossword puzzles for many years. I do a couple a day, even to this day. So puzzles are the thing. I was a soccer player my senior year of high school, and really growing up, I was always a soccer fanatic, but that's not really setting me up for puzzles. But chess was a thing I played with my grandfather, yes. Um, I wish I'd learned the Chinese game Go, because that's really the way they approach life and technology and politics, as opposed to us playing checkers sometimes in chess. Let me caveat that last statement is 10 of my 20 years in the Navy, I was a China targeter, if you would targeteer, if you will. I've focused on China for 10 of my 20 years.
Interesting.
Even when I was deployed to the desert, doing counterterrorism, I still had a China flavor to what I was doing.
This episode will be back after a quick break. Are you ready to significantly improve your strategic storytelling skills? If so, join my free storytelling challenge. Once you sign up, you'll get quick, impactful exercises for 5 consecutive days. Whether you want to boost your sales, enhance your marketing, or build a more vibrant company culture, this challenge will give you the tools to make that happen. Just check out the link in the show notes to get started. Okay, back to the episode. Interesting. Okay, so let's get to that. So, all right, so you're a teen transitioning. You had mentioned college, and then you had mentioned 20 years with the Navy. So then you're in the Navy, and then you also mentioned focusing on China. So what were some of the aspects of that focus?
Really, from a military side, I was focused on the protection of Taiwan, and how we were going to combat and protect Taiwan, combat Chinese aggression there. But even then, I had to understand how they went about their cyber technology. How are they attacking networks? Infrastructure here in the United States has been deeply penetrated by the Chinese, and that's not classified information I'm sharing. That's public knowledge. Um, I think it was 2012, 2014, they hacked into the network that protects all of our cleared information, all our cleared personnel, the data files on everybody who has a clearance in the United States. They slurped that from us. Um, Also, I got into a good understanding of how their spies work, how they use humans and technology together to try to trap people into sharing sensitive information. And in particular, I will share a quick story that I've been retired for 10 years now, coming up on 10 full years. I went back as a contractor for a little while, a couple of years ago, about 5 years ago. And the day I began my job there, I began getting at least five LinkedIn requests by very Chinese looking women. There were bots, I'm sure. There were not real people by any stretch, but 5 a day at least. I was at that job, that project lasted 18 months. And on the day I resigned, March 1st of 2023, they stopped. So what they do is they'll send out these bots and they'll try to get people to hook up with these, hook into these connections, and then they'll try to get you to start sharing a little bit of information, and then eventually they'll grab you with, well, do you want to come to China? Will you come speak for us on some topic that you're an expert on? And then they've got you, and then they want the real information from you as a result of that. It's an interesting process that they go through, but. So back to China, I learned a lot about China from those 10 years. I mean, I did it from the East Coast and a command I was at over here. I won't get into the exact tour I was at for that one, but I also did 6 years in Hawaii and 2 years in Japan,
Wow.
assigned to a ship out of Japan.
Wow. So based on everything you've experienced, you've gone through, are you hopeful for the next decade as it pertains to cybersecurity from a United States perspective? If we're talking about US versus China, are you hopeful?
I'm always hopeful when it comes to our ability to respond to threats. I'm not as always so hopeful when it comes to preparing for threats, because we usually take a blindered view to what the real risks are. well, I don't have to worry about that until something happens. Then I will start focusing on it. And that's true for politicians. It's true for the smallest of businesses. People don't worry about something until it's a problem. But once it's a problem, I'm very hopeful because we will take the sledgehammer to the fly, if you will, to try to fix the problem.
Wow. Okay. Interesting. You mentioned a word a little while ago, but I want to touch on it. You mentioned deception. You were talking about your books, and you had talked about there's a lot of books that talk a little bit about deception. So, based on your experience from what you've done, and also different things that you've read, what are some key indicators of deception? What are some things that we can all do, anyone listening to this episode can do to protect us from people that might want to be more deceptive?
Well, I think and this is one of the things that I offer as a service is due diligence from a bigger picture than just, is somebody lying to me? Um, let's look at it from a business perspective. You want to get into a business relationship with somebody, we'll do some due diligence and start asking some tougher questions and doing research to say, okay, did they really go to this university? Did they really buy this other company that they said that they did, or are they really honest? I have a funny story, a book I read a number of years ago, due diligence case where if you're going to hire a C-suite executive, for example, you need to do some background investigation on their personal lives as well, because that reputation can be ruined if you hire the wrong person. So the guy, I think it was a private investigator, followed this potential C-suite executive, found him on a golf course, called the current C-suite executive who was doing the hiring and said, call the guy and ask him where he is. And the candidate said, oh yeah, I'm about to run into a meeting. Whereas the guy had pictures of him on the golf course. Well, that's if he's going to lie about something as simple as that, what's he going to lie about in the boardroom?
Sure.
So you have to do due diligence. You have to understand what it is. You can't just take things in face value. Excuse me. You have to do research. You have to really not accept that people are always going to be honest with you. There are chances that the most honest person in the world can let some little things turn into lies rather.
Sure. I think that is a really good point. I appreciate you sharing that. I want to switch gears to AI. It's on the top of everyone's mind. I feel like it's been like 2 years now where everyone's obsessed with AI. AI, obviously it's here to stay, but there's become even more and more of an obsession. So what are the complications regarding securing data as it pertains to AI? And what are some of your concerns as we continue to immerse ourselves in AI?
Um, AI is a wonderful tool that you're right. It's been about 2 years that we've really become obsessed with it. The thing I have a problem with it is it's making us lazy when it comes to security, when it comes to writing papers, when it comes to doing research, that we lose touch with reality sometimes. It's not a it's not a good connection. AI can be a great security tool because it can set us up for the right policies. It can do the analysis of our networks for us if we need it to be done. Um, but it can also be a tool for no good by the hackers who can use it to circumvent our security measures in ways that we hadn't predicted as humans, unless we've used AI to do a really thorough analysis of our networks. And the problem is that, when you talk about hope earlier, I'm very hopeful because we have some very creative, inventive people in our country. We always talk about, oh, all the Chinese hackers, the Russian hackers, the North Korean hackers. But we have some pretty nifty people in our country too, who have some really sneaky ways of using technology, and AI can really bolster that capability. So hopefully, there's two sides to this where AI can help you or it can harm you, but in the medium, in the middle there, there's still a human interaction that has to happen somewhere. And people can get very creative and use AI to be very sneaky in protecting or protecting or invading your networks.
Sure. Yeah. So I want to touch on a few points. So when you had mentioned about doing due diligence and research, because we want to make sure someone's has a caliber of integrity that we want, and then to pair that with AI, one of the things that I've seen that no one's talking about, but is becoming more and more of a problem, is yes, there's a lot of, let's say, a C-suite executive or someone in a decision maker seat that uses AI for an email or for some type of writing, and then they appear that they're really, really good at communication, and then you meet them in person and there's no connection at all. And there's like a fraying of trust. And it almost, to me, it lowers a little bit of the integrity piece because it's this perception that they're a certain person that they're not. So it's just interesting to me that AI is definitely taking over in ways, creating that laziness that you had said. But I want to talk about the laziness of cybersecurity and how companies might be utilizing AI to give them ideas on how they could solve cybersecurity problems, but that might be getting in the way of reaching out to someone like you or another entity that actually does know what they're talking about. Can you speak to that a little bit about companies that might just go into ChatGPT and ask for a security plan, but not be implementing it in the proper way?
Yeah, and I think that that's a very great question because it's very easy for anybody to go into ChatGPT, write me a identity access management plan, write me a user agreement plan, something that says what we're going to do and how you accept you're going to use the network. But if you're not following it up with log reviews, for example, to say, okay, let's say, for example, ChatGPT writes up a policy that says you're not going to go to these websites, 5, 10 websites, whatever it is. And then you go, okay, I've got a policy. ChatGPT gave me this great policy, and I've had people sign that they're going to not use this system in a way that violates this policy. Great. But then they don't do a network log review. What good is that policy? So many people write policies for the sake of writing policies. It doesn't matter whether it's ones that I've just mentioned or any number of policies that are required by NIST or ISO to be certified and to reduce your risk. And let's be honest, this all comes down to reducing your risk. If you're not going to follow it up with a true understanding of how your network operates, then you're going to be at a higher risk because your policies are as good as using them to wipe down the counter in your kitchen. They're useless, really. Policy ChatGPT is great for writing the policy, but it's not great for human interaction and following through with connection with people to say, look, are you really doing what you said you would?
Sure. So wipe down the counter of your kitchen. That's not what I thought you were going to say. I
I
appreciate you.
I am a
Well
sailor
done.
at heart. I'm a sailor at heart, but I know my points.
Well done. So speaking of points, can you give us a few points where, let's say, a company, an individual listening, their company doesn't have a plan at all. They know that they need to do something. What would be a few things that you would say, here's where you need to start. This is what you need to do to at least start the process of becoming more secure as an organization?
Well, I mentioned it earlier at the very beginning, is the first thing you have to do is identify your critical information. If you don't know what you have to protect to be marketable and profitable, then everything else is useless. And it can be anything from your intellectual property to HR information, Privacy Act information, to healthcare information. Even having some knowledge of one of your employees' healthcare concerns, that's critical information. You have to protect it. And then identifying the severity of impact of that information. Intellectual property is the holy grail, if you will, because that's what's going to make your company keep being a company. So I'm not advocating for top secret, confidential like we had in the military, because it's too militaristic to begin with. And I think there's some confusion that can be brought there. But having sensitive, non-sensitive public information, three different layers, can be very helpful for, okay, who has access, who shouldn't have access, when should they have access, and then, okay, I'm going to look at that critical information, then I'm going to determine what policies and infrastructure do I have to have around it, technically and policy wise, to protect it. Then I have to have a plan to ensure it's going to be protected through exercising, such as simulated phishing emails. Make sure people follow the policy that they're not going to click on unknown emails. Running tests of the physical security is a big piece of this too. It's not just cyber, like we said before the show, cybersecurity is a nebulous term. Everybody thinks of the trons and the use of a computer or a tablet or a phone, but it's also the physical. Am I protecting it through a building network infrastructure of having to badge in, having a safe, having, rooms within rooms to protect, like we have in the military with sensitive compartmented information facilities, SCIFs. I'm not advocating that for every company, don't get me wrong, but you have to have layers of protection. It can't just be, well, I wrote a policy, I've put it in a file cabinet with a key on it, key lock, and that's how secure it's going to be. But if it's really that sensitive, I need to do some more to it. So again, we're at the protect level, running simulations of protecting, and how do we red team, actually have somebody like me come in and try to break in, whether electronically, physically, or social engineering. And then going back and reviewing. It's a constant process. It can't be a fire and forget. It has to be redone over and over, because the threats are not giving up just because they failed once. It doesn't mean they're going to stop. They're going to keep trying to come in to get your information.
Wow. Is that a service that you provide to try to break in, to show them how they're not secure?
Yes, and from a physical to cyber, I have a hacking background. Um, I also am a private investigator, so I can do a lot of um, the surveillance to social engineering to physically trying to, and it's not going to physically break anything, but you try to test the physical, the cyber, and the human, what I call the pie, the personnel, infrastructure, and equipment. Try to break into how do we test each of these different levels of protections that you set up to make sure your information doesn't get released to the public.
Wow, that's fascinating. I appreciate you sharing that. And I
Yeah.
appreciate your time today. There
Yeah.
were a few things that you had mentioned that I had not thought of before. I really appreciate that. So there's three in particular I'm going to take away from our conversation. The one thing that you mentioned was due diligence versus just lying. We have to do our due diligence. You had mentioned intentional research on business and personal life. I think that's really important. The second point that you mentioned is just how AI is making us lazy. You and I both see it. Companies are utilizing AI and not really focusing on the strategy aspect, on how to implement it. I appreciate you mentioned that. And then the third and final piece is that identifying critical information. You had talked about layering it, the severity of the impact regarding that information. I think that's something that everyone listening to this podcast episode should do immediately. Try to figure out, identify that critical information. So
And I
once
can
they,
help.
sure.
I can help with that, identification, because it's not always something that pops at somebody. Yes, if you've created a new widget that has a new chemical or new process of making it that saves a company, saves the industry millions of dollars over 10 years, that's obvious. But it could be something as simple as an idea that you've had that you didn't think was really that important. But if we walk through what makes your company tick, we might pull that out and say, okay, look, you really have something you didn't identify, but is critical to your company. We walk through that kind of a mini workshop, if you will, as we go through the process.
Sure. Okay. If someone wants to get more information on you, what you do, where's the best place they can go to get that information?
Well, the easiest answer is either snelladvisory.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn. I'm always posting something on there about this subject or espionage in general. It's, two things that are really fascinating to me are espionage/security, protecting information, and mental health issues. So you'll see me posting on those two subjects pretty frequently.
Okay. I will include your website and LinkedIn in the show notes so people can just click and go from there. So Dave, thanks again for your time today. I really appreciate it.
It's a lot of fun. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. If you found this discussion helpful, please leave a review, since positive reviews help others find these conversations. New episodes drop regularly, so stay tuned. And remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to take action, you must share more stories.